Hi, I'm Spencer Sunshine, and I want to thank you for coming to check out my presentation, Splinters or Seeds, From Skokie to Siege, the Influence of the Splintering of the NS-WPP. So National Socialism in the United States has not received a lot of scholarly attention as an overall phenomenon. There's decent coverage of both the pre-war era and from the 1980s on, although even then many major players do not have a scholarly book on them or only one. But from this, what's almost entirely overlooked is the period starting immediately after war and running through the early 1980s. And this means that we're missing the story of how post-war neo-Nazism came to be and why it looks the way it does today. Let me just note first that unless I'm going to specify otherwise, everything in this talk is going to refer to the United States. So one of the rare exceptions to the scholarly literature are two books on George Lincoln Rockwell, who's the founder of the American Nazi Party. The party's origins are in a very fertile time for the post-war far right. 1958 was the year that Willis Carto's Liberty Lobby was officially launched. It was also the founding year for the John Birch Society, the National States Rights Party, and for the immediate precursor of the American Nazi Party, which was refounded under that name the next year. Rockwell is usually portrayed as a clown, but in fact, amongst other things, he created the epistemological space to be an open National Socialist in the post-war United States. That is, he showed that one could publicly be a swastika-waving, brown shirt-wearing neo-Nazi. And this was different than other existing projects run by neo-Nazis, but who kept the swastika and Hitler part under the radar, such as the Liberty Lobby or the National States Rights Party. Rockwell derided these actors as sneaky Nazis. In 1967, just before his assassination, the American Nazi Party was renamed by Rockwell as the National Socialist White People's Party, the NS-WPP, and I'll be using this acronym a lot. Matthew Koehl, spelled K-O-E-H-L, took over as leader after Rockwell's death. And while the charismatic Rockwell had inspired intense dedication from his followers, Koehl was unpopular with the party members. I'd like to suggest that, especially when many members and groups splintered off Koehl's NS-WPP in the 1970s, and especially in 1973 and 1974, this set up the groundwork for today's neo-Nazi movement. First, it was during this period that the shape of today's movement emerged. And second, many actors who became important to the white supremacist movement up through the present day started their own projects then. And I want to mention here just quickly, the party did survive the splintering, but it became largely irrelevant afterwards. Now this period may sound obscure to you, but you're probably already familiar with its influence. To show this, I'll name 7 things coming out of the NS-WPP crack-up that you probably already know if you would pay attention to the far right. One is William Pierce's book, The Turner Diaries, which inspired the Oklahoma City bombing. 2 is the wounding of Hustler publisher Larry Flynt in 1978, who was shot by serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin. 3 is the 1978 Supreme Court ruling that a neo-Nazi group led by Frank Collin could march in Skokie, Illinois. 4 is the 1989 election of Klan leader David Duke as a Louisiana state representative. 5 is Don Black's popular white supremacist website, Stormfront. 6 is the 2018 Illinois congressional primary win of a so-called Holocaust denier, Art Jones. And 7 is James Mason's book Siege, a pro-terrorism book that is influential on today's alt-right neo-Nazis. Now the common denominator of all 7 of these different individuals is that they were all NS-WPP members who left in the 1970s. I'll explain very briefly how the splintering happened. After Rockwell's death, a triumvirate ran the party. It was Koehl, Pierce, and Robert Lloyd. But in 1970, Koehl decided he wanted to be the undisputed Führer, and after a factional battle, forced the other 2 out. Pierce went on to run his own group, which in 1974 became the National Alliance. The next year, its newspaper serialized The Turner Diaries, which was published as a standalone book in 1978. Now this poorly written novel describes a coming race war, and it includes a scene where a federal building is destroyed by a fertilizer bomb. And this famously inspired the 1995 fertilizer bomb attack on an Oklahoma City federal building, which ended up killing 168. Another activist who left in 1970 was Frank Collin. He wanted to continue Rockwell's successful work in Chicago's Marquette Park neighborhood, which at the time was resisting desegregation. Collins's group, the NSPA, the National Socialist Party of America, attracted thousands of locals to its rallies in the park. The city of Chicago banned the rallies, and so Collins said that instead he was going to march in suburban Skokie, Illinois, which was a place where many Holocaust survivors lived. In return, Skokie's government tried to block that rally as well, but the ACLU sued on the Nazis' behalf, and the Supreme Court took their side. Now, some people are confused by this, but the Nazis never held the march in Skokie. The whole thing was actually a feint to allow the NSPA to rally in Marquette Park, which was where their base of support was. The Skokie case attracted a lot of national attention, and it even inspired a made-for-TV movie. But I think it's most famous for inspiring the scene in The Blues Brothers, where Jim Belushi says, "I hate Illinois Nazis," and then Dan Aykroyd proceeds to run Frank Collin and the NSPA off a bridge. Also starting in 1969, David Duke was in 3 successive student and youth groups affiliated with the NS-WPP. In 1971, he went off on his own and soon was the leader of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. This was a new kind of Klan group, and the mass media lapped up the well-spoken, college-educated Duke, who wore suits instead of robes. Duke's group, in turn, had absorbed a number of American Nazi Party and NSWPP veterans, including James K. Warner, Carl Hand, William Grimstad, and Don Black. And you'll see some of these figures being involved in all of these other former NSWPP projects. So Duke started running for office, and in 1989 famously won a Louisiana state representative race, although he only served 1 term. He remains active today as a kind of elder statesman of the white supremacist movement, and was at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017. But as I mentioned, it was in 1973 and 1974 that the party really cracked up. Already an unpopular leader, one of the reasons that many activists gave for leaving was that KL was forcing local chapters to sell their bookstores, which they had bought themselves, while he was going to keep all the money. These so-called bookstores didn't really sell books, but they were storefronts where interested parties could come and pick up literature, and they doubled as a local party headquarters. Cale's jealousy of local leaders was also a factor, and he particularly had it out for Joseph Tomasi, a successful Los Angeles organizer. In 1974, Tomasi left and formed the National Socialist Liberation Front, which openly espoused guerrilla warfare. This group actually lasted until 1986 under 4 different leaders, all of whom were former NSWPP members, including the aforementioned Carl Hand. Another California leader who broke off was Alan Vincent, who confusingly renamed his group the National Socialist White Workers' Party, or NS-WPP. A fairly well-known documentary was made about his group called California Reich, and if you're interested in this period, it's available on YouTube. I can highly recommend that you watch it. In 1975, Southern Ohio's National Socialist Movement was formed by 2 former and 1 current NSWPP members. This group is still around today, and for many years, starting in the early aughts, was the largest neo-Nazi group in the country. If you're familiar with Jeff Scoop, who was popular on the contemporary speaking circuit as a former neo-Nazi, he was the group's 3rd leader, although he was much too young to be in the NSWPP. So now, starting in 1975, these splinter parties tried to form a new umbrella group called the National Socialist Congress. As you might expect, they quickly broke up into feuding factions, but the importance of this attempt would come later. From 1977 to 1980, a sniper and former party member, Joseph Paul Franklin, killed up to 22 people with a focus on murdering black and white couples. His most famous target was Larry Flynt, the publisher of the adult magazine Hustler. Flynt, who had angered Franklin not by publishing pornography because Franklin read Hustler, but by publishing an interracial spread, was shot and paralyzed in Lawrenceville, Georgia. And this last fact is especially important because Lawrenceville is my hometown, and while I was writing this talk, I Google mapped it, and the shooting happened about a mile from where I lived, although I was a child then. Other NSWPP members who left in the 1970s and went on to bigger things included Don Black. He was part of Duke's Klan group, but only really hit his stride in 1995 when he founded a website called Stormfront. Until the alt-right era, this was the most popular website for white supremacists. Art Jones also left in the 1970s and remained a small-time player in the Chicago scene. I mention him mostly because he achieved some national fame during the Trump administration when, in 2018, he won the Republican Party primary for the Illinois 3rd Congressional District. What had actually happened is the Republicans forgot to put someone up against him, but the newspapers picked up on this, that like Holocaust deniers are being elected under Trump, which is literally true. The last activist of importance to leave the NS-WPP was Rick Cooper in 1980, and while he was a minor figure, his departure is nice because it neatly bookends the splits between 1970 and 1980. After all this, in 1983, the NSWPP changed its name a third time and became the New Order. It stopped holding public rallies, turned inward, and transformed itself into an esoteric Hitler-worshipping cult that still exists today. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. Spencer, he gave a sectology of a bunch of 1970s neo-Nazi groups. It was mostly a bunch of acronyms. Why is this stuff important? This period is influential for post-war National Socialism in the United States for three different reasons. One, as I've outlined, a number of the specific groups and members who broke off became quite influential, or at least notorious. And this was not just in the 1970s when they dominated the neo-Nazi movement, but the influence of some of them continues into the present day. Two, part of National Socialism is the Führer principle, the leadership principle. Following Hitler's example, neo-Nazis want an unquestioned leader and correspondingly a single party. So even though there were some splits under Rockwell, the American Nazi Party remained as the single major neo-Nazi group in the United States. But in the 1970s, the movement became mostly small local groups or some national ones with only a few chapters. And this is the way that the neo-Nazi movement is still structured today. I believe that if Rockwell had lived, or if Kale had been a better leader, one main party would have persisted at least for quite a while. Last is that neo-Nazi calls for violence blossomed in the 1970s. Now, both Rockwell and Kale had studiously stuck to advocating only legal political work. But by the end of the 1960s, some in the NS-WPP, including Pierce and Tomasi, started to openly advocate violence. And their later groups amplified these calls, and in 1975 they were joined in a third group by this, the National Socialist Movement, which had been co-founded by James Mason. Around the same time, a parallel phenomenon emerged, the neo-Nazi mass murderer. Although a common thing today, the first main incident was only in 1977 when Frederick Cowan, a supporter of the National States Rights Party, massacred 6 people at his workplace in New Rochelle, New York. And this was followed by murders committed by other NSWPP members or former members, including Franklin's 3-year killing spree, a 1977 murder by Ray Schultz in suburban Chicago, and 3 Cleveland murders in 1982 by Frank Spizak. Now, during this time, James Mason, who held dual membership in the National Socialist Movement and the National Socialist Liberation Front, was part of the attempt by the splinter groups to unify as the National Socialist Congress. Mason, however, was trying to push the various groups towards an armed struggle approach. However, in 1977, he also started praising these random racist murderers that had started. Mason's famous book Siege, which inspires neo-Nazi terrorists around the globe today, is an anthology of excerpts from his newsletter of the same name, which was published in the 80s. It's primarily his reflections on the American Nazi Party, the NSWPP, and what happened as the NSWPP both broke up and the various splinter groups tried to cooperate together in the mid-70s. Siege's famous answer to the strategic and tactical questions of the neo-Nazis of that day was total attack or total dropout. Mason argues there's no use in engaging in legal political activism like public rallies. One could either drop out of society or go the route of violence and terrorism, but do it with style. Total attack might be either armed struggle groups or lone wolf murderers like Franklin or Cowan. So Siege is literally James Mason's reflections on and conclusions about the splintering of the NSWPP in the 1970s. And so, if for no other reason other than inspiring Siege, the breakup of the NSWPP still influences the neo-Nazi movement today, not just in the United States, but around the world.